Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Experience Relativity podcast. I am your host, Shelton Smith, aka P. Winslow Lee. You can find me on IG at P.Winslow_Lee. You can also find Experience_Relativity for the podcast. Thank you for the incredible gift of your mind space, your time, and your attention. It is greatly appreciated. It is February, aka Black History Month, and the theme for the podcast continues to be the land of the free was simultaneously the home of the slave. And this is a play on the famous phrase from the national anthem. Be sure to visit www.experiencerelativity.com. We've got an email sign-up list live now. Why do you want to grant me access to your inbox? Because you can get incredibly valuable information on the podcast, as well as notifications when merchandise is available, product launches, and giveaways. So that's why you want to grant me access to your inbox. Soon we will have merchandise available to the community for purchase, i.e. these Experience Relativity sweatshirts. They are going to be available in both black and white. And the only way you'll know when they're available is to sign up for the mail list. So please go to www.experiencerelativity.com and throw in your name and your email address so we can notify you as soon as they're ready. These are high quality, built to last, with puff embroidery on the front of the hoodies, as well as if you pick one for a theme, for the monthly themes, then you'll be able to get the monthly theme screen printed on the back of your hoodie. But without further ado, we'll get into story time. Now, it's Valentine's Day weekend, so I want to talk to you about unconditional love. I was reading an article from the Newport Institute, and it defined unconditional love as being our true selves without fear we will be abandoned if we say or do something that is not liked. Less judging, less scorning for flaws and missteps, and more compassion and acceptance. I used to think that I knew what unconditional love was. Something like being able to love someone who instigated an unwarranted arrest, or being able to still love someone who said to me, everything that has ever happened in my life, I deserved. And this is a person who knew that I was sexually abused as a child, and also that I lost my mother when I was 19 years old. And regardless of those things happening and those things being said, I still found a way within myself to love that person just as I loved them beforehand. Now, I thought that it really meant being able to love someone beyond the limits of your everyday average person or what people deem to be normal or acceptable. But to be honest, I didn't truly see unconditional love until I had my children. No matter how terrible a job I felt I was doing, or I actually was doing, my kids' love was unwavering. It's the kind of love that makes you feel like you're a superhero. That changed as they got older, but that's likely because I showed, therefore I taught them to love conditionally. Now, we're wrapping up Valentine's Day weekend, and the irony of Valentine's Day, the love day, being in Black History Month is not lost on me. I think the irony for me stems from the fact that love is probably the biggest factor that keeps us a part of this nation. We have a general love for humanity that would not see us raise generations corrupted with hatred at the center of their hearts. Also, a general love for what we helped create, this land of the free and home of the brave. Speaking of love and its resulting creations, I have a fun fact. Did you know that the average newborn's heart rate is between 120 and 160 beats per minute? Now, the average adult's heart rate is between 60 and 100 beats per minute. Now, if an adult had a newborn's heart rate, it would place them at increased risk of heart strain, dizziness, shortness of breath, and even heart failure. Now that I'm done reading the side effects of prescription strength experience relativity, the heart rate of a newborn is actually the inspiration for the title of today's episode, Red Glare. Now, from the national anthem, it speaks of the rocket's red glare. But when I think of the red glare, I think of the persistently beating heart of a newborn or a newly born nation, relatively speaking, of course, growing and developing with every heartbeat. I want to talk about the love that is raising our nation, relatively a 5-year-old little America when compared to the oldest nations. Now, I want to get into some terminology that'll be a little bit new for this podcast, and it just continues to develop. Now, every X has one slant and then another slant, okay? So we'll get into slant 1, which is the existing love. And this love that characterizes this one slant is love despite. Love despite, and I'm using a particular word because the other one will make itself known when we get to slant 2. Love despite. Love despite, or the word despite, represents a persistent love. I would say that this is the love that the non-enslaved Americans, as characterized from the first episode. So if you haven't watched it, go back and watch that one, and you'll understand that this is kind of broken down into the non-enslaved Americans experience and then the enslaved Americans experience. And that includes the descendants of non-enslaved Americans and the descendants of enslaved Americans. So this love despite is a characteristic of the non-enslaved Americans. And when we talk about that love despite, I guess you would ask yourself, should they love despite what is done? Now, in these examples of these slants, when I talk about a child, I want to talk about the creation of the love that we mentioned earlier in the episode. The child is America. That's why I said little relatively 5-year-old America. Should that child be loved despite the things that it has done? I mean, when we get into the idea of parental love, you can look no further than, relatively recent events of the departing president, Joe Biden, pardoning his child and several other family members for that matter, but we'll focus on his child. Now, I don't think anybody had any issue with Joe Biden pardoning his son, aside from, maybe saying he wasn't going to do it. But the idea of pardoning your child is not a foreign concept. So nobody's really upset about the idea of someone being pardoned. And I think that is representative of the love despite what your kid did. There's a essence of wanting to remove suffering from your child, which again, for most parents is a natural thing that parents may want to do. I'll give you an example of this because my 13-year-old son has type 1 diabetes. Now, if I could take on type 1 diabetes for my son, I absolutely would. There's not an amount of money that you could pay me where I would say, nope, I would not take that burden away from my son. But then when I also think about my 13-year-old son, one of the things that I'm constantly saying about how I parent him is that I'm not going to stand between you and your consequences. So I think when we step outside of my, particular circumstance and just talk about parents, you want to remove suffering for your kid. But there's a difference between, preventing suffering for your child and standing between your child and the consequences of their actions. Now, from the non-enslaved Americans' take or slant on this, I want to explore an idea briefly of racism as a disease. Now, as a parent of this little America, if racism was a disease that America suffered from, as a parent, you would want to remove that suffering. When you look at the idea of what racism is, removing that suffering would be one or the other of two things. Now, you can remove the suffering from the disease of racism and kind of look the other way, or just not acknowledge that it's such a problem that your child has and just pretend like it's not happening. And that would kind of enable America to continue down this path of racism. Then you have the path of accountability. So as a parent, when I say I'm not going to stand between my child and their consequences, that's the example of allowing your child to be accountable for their actions and actually healing themselves, understanding how to learn, grow, and develop out of some illness that they may have, that they have the ability of, healing from. Now, I want to share another interesting tidbit with you. And I found this in the National Institute of Health's Library of Medicine. After several racist killings in the civil rights era, a group of black psychiatrists sought to have extreme bigotry classified as a mental disorder. The Association of Psychiatrics, the American Association of Psychiatrics officials rejected this recommendation, arguing, and this is the really important part about this, super important, arguing that because so many Americans are racist, even extreme racism in this country is normative. It is a cultural problem rather than an indication of psychopathology. So, extreme racism could not be classified as a mental disorder because it's actually normal here. Yeah. Now let's get into slant 2. Slant 2 is love in spite. And love in spite of something is different than love despite. Love despite says, I know what you did. I acknowledge it. But despite what you did, I'm going to continue to love you. Love in spite, on the other hand, is a defiant love. And this is the love that the enslaved Americans and those who are descendants of enslaved Americans represent. This love is indicative of sort of like a endurance type love or an acceptance type love, like you're seeking acceptance. Now, when we're talking about little America again, when we have to defiantly love America, you got to ask yourself the question, should we love this child? I think in both cases, asking that question is kind of silly. It's your child. Why would you not love your child? But I think there's an interesting twist for the enslaved Americans' experience. I learned a new word when I was thinking about this podcast episode, or a new phrase, and it's called filial hatred. Filial means related to a child's duty or connection to a parent. Hatred, I think we got this, but I'm going to say it just for the sake of the broadcast. Animosity towards or rejection towards the very source of one's existence. Now, if we're talking about America as a child, that's interesting. Filial hatred. Man. So when we talk about the enslaved American and their descendants, they're the builders and the nurturers of America. The words that come to mind: labor, innovation, and resilience. That's what your parent represents, or that's what, the enslaved American in relation to the child that is America represents. Then you got this sort of sentiment that America gives back to the descendants of enslaved Americans and enslaved Americans. It's like guilt, denial, and resentment over the foundational truths of where you came from. I think a big part of this, and if you've listened to any of the other episodes from previous seasons, I really don't like buzzwords, but I'm going to use one. Unresolved trauma. Little America seems to have some unresolved trauma, and it manifests as sort of like the child hating to hear what the parents sacrificed in order for them to even exist. Imagine when you were young, if your parents kept telling you every day about what they had to go through for you to be here. Now take that and make America the child, and make the enslaved Americans or descendants of enslaved Americans the parent. You keep telling the child about what you had to go through, and the child grows up with this guilt, denial, and resentment towards you, because all you do is remind them of that. Now, I have a question. Can you blame the child? The hatred really stems from the child's inability to reconcile the debt. Even if you told your child everything you went through for your child to be here, there's nothing your child can do about that. They cannot reconcile the debt. And then there's an ongoing refusal from the child to recognize and to have equality or justice even. Yet, we still defiantly love this child with every fiber of our being, despite every logical ounce of us saying that it doesn't make sense to love a child that hates you. Now we've gotten through the two slants, and now we're at the crux of this experience. There are two parents. There are two experiences. There are two perspectives, and there is one child. We hear a lot about the founding fathers, but what of the founding mothers? And I definitely don't mean their wives. If the non-enslaved Americans could be seen as the founding fathers, then the enslaved Americans can be seen as the founding mothers. They bared the labor. They carried America. They nursed and nurtured it to the point of being a world power. But here's the thing. Mom and dad are still together, and the relationship, well, it's complicated and it's strained. they'll have to figure out their own feelings. But most importantly, both must figure out how to contribute to raising America up to be something they can both be proud of. Something that they both envisioned it would be in the midst of its conception. America will only be what we raise it to be. Now, if you're feeling the message of the podcast and you wear your heart on your sleeve or your chest, it's not only about representing your experience, but it's about engaging and productive but challenging conversations that bring us closer together. If we sit at opposite ends of a table, shouting about our experience with the world between us, we'll never make progress. It's about conversations that we can have that we're willing to be open to having in close proximity to one another. That's where the unique and nuanced experiences can be shared. There is where reflex empathy is developed. You know the usual. Like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast. It's still available in audio format on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, along with wherever else you listen to your podcast. Catch me next week. But until then, thank you for exploring the space between us with Experience Relativity. Your presence is always met with gratitude. Love you.
Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.
Experience Relativity.